See that? Like one pigeon just like barely makes it over the fence. So now it's just, I just don't understand. Like immediately shot, just up in the air, and then they're shot. You can see the, Jesus, this really is hard to watch. So you can see them like twitching on the ground. Hello, and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents, which is a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular focus on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. That name, Seeking Rents, comes from a term in economics called rent seeking. And rent seeking is what's happening when someone with lots of wealth and influence, like a big business or a billionaire, uses their wealth and influence to get laws changed in their favor in a way that allows them to capture even more wealth and influence for themselves, usually at the expense of someone else. So I think I've talked about on this podcast before how obviously we pay really close attention to the governor's office and the Florida legislature at Seeking Rents. And every year at the end of the Florida legislature's annual legislative session, I usually submit a couple of pretty big public records requests. And these can sort of take different kind of flavors. You know, in years past, I'll sometimes ask for everything going through one or two specific committees in the legislature, almost always including the tax committees in the House and Senate, just because I really do think tax policy is one of the most important things politicians do. Sometimes we'll ask for, everything from a handful of key aides in the governor's office, because I think it's super important to know what Ron DeSantis is really working on. As we've learned from some of these requests in the past, what he's talking about publicly and trying to get attention to is not always the same things he's working on privately behind the scenes. And so these kinds of records requests help unearth those kinds of details. And sometimes I'll ask for everything from a handful of specific lobbyists or lobbying firms. Usually, when there are particular issues that I've been following, writing about, podcasting, and I know those lobbyists have been involved with that issue, I'll ask for everything from them sometimes. But the key with these things is I always keep them really broad, and so that means a couple of things. First, they always take a month or two to fulfill because they're big. These are big records requests. They also produce hundreds, sometimes a few thousand pages worth of emails and stuff, and they're also almost always really expensive. So here's where I remind you that everything we do on Seeking Rents, all our stories on our newsletter, all the podcasts we produce, all of that stuff is free to everybody. There's nothing is behind a paywall. That's a central premise here of what we're doing. We don't want anything behind a paywall. But there is an option to voluntarily pay for a subscription if you can afford one. And if you can, please think about doing that, because the money we get from those paid subscriptions help pay for these public records requests. And then the other thing about keeping them broad is they always turn up just a ton of stuff that I had no idea about. So it could take a few shapes. Sometimes it's details about issues that I've been writing about that I wasn't aware of. It provides new insights about who was really pushing, who was really driving the train on an issue or driving the bus or whatever transportation metaphor you want to use there. Oftentimes it's issues I had no idea about at all, bills that we hadn't sort of made it onto my radar in any way, and you're suddenly learning some of the backstory behind that, and it's really sort of interesting. Or things that you thought about one way, you suddenly realize there's a whole different perspective of looking at them. And oftentimes it's these secretive issues that never actually pop publicly during the session, but are stuff that people are already working on for next year's session. And so you start to get, it's a chance to use these records to get out in front of some of those issues and try and learn them, just so you can, have as good a public debate as possible around these, because one of the other things you learn from these records requests is just how much secrecy is involved in the lawmaking process. So I say all that because I've started to get some of these records requests back from this session, from the 2025 session, which ended technically in June, although the bulk of it ended back in May, which is when I did most of these requests. And they have already turned up like a number of really interesting things, again, in all kinds of the buckets that I just talked about, shedding new light on issues we've been writing about before, unearthing new issues that we had no idea about, and sort of giving a clue as to what might be coming down the pike next year's session, which will begin in January, if I remember correctly. So what I thought I'd do today in today's podcast is start telling some of the stories that came out of these records. And we'll start with one in particular that involves a beef jerky magnate who got into hot water with animal rights activists and then went like run into the Florida legislature and Ron DeSantis for help. And so we'll sort of walk through that in a bit. But this is just the first of a number of stories we'll be doing both on the podcast, in the newsletter. So again, if you haven't already, make sure to sign up for the newsletter. SeekingRentsFL.com is the easiest way to find us. And don't forget those voluntary paid subscriptions if you can afford them. And also, of course, click like and subscribe. Okay, so let's jump into this first story out of these that came out of these records. And I want to start this by jumping back to February of 2024. So early last year, at a place called the Quail Creek Sporting Ranch in Okeechobee, Florida. This is a roughly like 700-acre shooting ranch in a tiny rural part of the state. It's about an hour and a half south of Orlando, dead south, kind of getting close to Lake Okeechobee. This is in the interior, the southern interior of the state. And like I said, it's a big shooting range where they do clay shooting, they do tournaments, they host fundraisers. I suspect, I don't know this, but I suspect this is probably a popular site for political fundraisers, or has been used in the past. It also hosts an annual event called the Jack Links Cup, which is a big clay shooting tournament with $300,000 in prizes apparently, and sponsored by Jack Links, the beef jerky, Jack Links Meat Snacks, the big beef jerky company. And I mention that because Quail Creek is actually owned by a guy by the name of Troy Link, who is the CEO of Jack Links Meat Snacks. He's the son of the company founder, who was Jack Link, joined the company in high school and is now the CEO. This is a big business. I was looking around for information. It's privately held, but the Minneapolis Star Tribune, I believe, is where I saw this. It's a company. It's a $2 billion company now that apparently sells a bag of jerky or meat sticks every 30 seconds in the United States. So this is a big company. And so Troy Link owns this place called the Quail Creek Sporting Ranch in Okeechobee. And back to February 2024, the Quail Creek hosted an invite-only event called the Swamp Shootout. And I'm looking right now at a promo flyer for this thing. This was invite-only. It required a $600 non-refundable deposit to get in. There was going to be 90 main event shootings, and this was a pigeon shoot. And so, I wasn't familiar with pigeon shooting until this, but if you are not, this is kind of, I'm not a hunter, although I occasionally very occasionally fly fish with my father, so I'm not averse to these kinds of activities necessarily, but this seems particularly barbaric. Basically, a bunch of live pigeons are trapped and kept in these boxes, and then sprung out of them. They flutter up in the air, and they're immediately shot by a bunch of people standing in a line, standing at pads, I don't know, a few yards away or something like that. And there's, people win money based on how many pigeons they kill, or people gamble on this sort of stuff apparently. And like I said, it's tough to watch. You see like pigeons don't always get killed right away, and oftentimes people then run onto the field and like snap their necks right there. Sometimes they manage to make it a little ways away wounded, but then get killed by like a hawk or something. Then these birds of prey that grab them while they're wounded then are potentially ingesting the bullets. And there's like, obviously, again, I'm not a pigeon shooter, but I don't think anybody's eating pigeon or mounting pigeon. So this seems like just like pure blood sport. It's not the sort of thing I think I could ever understand people doing, but your mileage may vary on this. Anyway, so the Swamp Shootout, this big pigeon shoot at Quail Creek Sporting Ranch was held on a weekend in late February of 2024. And animal rights groups caught the whole thing on video. That's part of how I've come to understand just how sort of gruesome this is. And I'm gonna play a bit of that video right now, just so you can get a flavor of what they caught. And this is footage they caught using drones, secret drones, recording the property from above. So let's watch a little bit of that now. So we're looking down at the property. You can see pigeons fluttering up after they're released out of and you can see they flutter up and are immediately shot down. And then these are the kids, I guess, that are sent out to like bag them. You see that, like one pigeon just like barely makes it over the fence. So now it's just, I just don't understand. Like immediately shot, just up in the air, and then they're shot. You can see the, Jesus, this really is hard to watch. So you can see them like twitching on the ground. And apparently, like the job here of people that run out is to grab them and then like snap their necks. Yeah, I got to tell you, it's like a callousness to. Yeah, watching something like this, you just sort of wonder, like, what goes through the brain of a person that participates in an activity like this. I mentioned that I fish occasionally with my father. Everything we catch, we either eat or release. This idea of just like killing just for like pure blood sport is, I'm not entirely sure how this is a whole lot different than like, you know, cockfighting or dog fighting in terms of just the cruelty of it all. But I don't know. Maybe there's pigeon shooters that are watching this or listening to this, and they can sort of weigh in on what the kind of value is. I think that gives you a flavor of just what kind of activity this is. And again, animal rights groups caught it all on tape, and immediately they launched a campaign around this, targeting Troy Link of Jack Links because targeting with animal cruelty. They ran like, and this, by the way, the groups behind this were a couple of groups called Animal Wellness Action and Shark, which I guess stands for Showing Animals Respect and Kindness. And so they ran this massive campaign calling Troy Link out for animal cruelty, demanding an investigation, a criminal investigation, because pigeon shooting is illegal in some states, although not in Florida. They drew a number of media headlines. A lot of local media wrote stories about this. A lot of it anchored by this sort of like really grim video footage. Like I said, they called for a criminal investigation, and nothing ever came of that because, again, pigeon shooting is not actually illegal in Florida. It is in a number of states, but not here. What is illegal in Florida is recording people on their private property with a drone. So, I'm not a lawyer, but the statute seems pretty clear. I'm just going to read a bit of it. It says a person may not use a drone equipped with an imaging device to record an image of privately owned real property, or of the owner or their invitees, with the intent to conduct surveillance if the person has an expectation of privacy on that property. Now, the law in Florida, this is illegal, but it's enforced by, it's a civilly enforced law. So meaning if you feel like someone has illegally recorded you with a drone, you can sue that person. You can sue them for damages. You can sue them you can get your attorney's fees paid if you win, that sort of thing. So that's the enforcement mechanism on this law, is a civil lawsuit. Now, as far as I know, no civil lawsuit was ever filed out of this. I reached out to Troy Link and Jack Links for this story and never heard back. I reached out to the animal rights groups, and they told me that they never were served with any lawsuits or anything like that. And so eventually the story died down. Like, again, there was that round of like really sort of ugly headlines, embarrassing headlines probably. There was a campaign targeting Jack Links, urging people to call and contact the company, that sort of thing. But no criminal investigation came out of it on the one side, and no civil lawsuit came out of it on the other side. So that the story seemed to die down, and it seemed to blow over at that point. But then a little over a year later, in May of this year, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed a bill that essentially criminalized what just happened. It criminalized using drones to record private property. So it turned a violation. So if you record someone on their private property with a drone, that is now a first degree misdemeanor in Florida, punishable by up to 1 year in prison. If you record illegally and distribute the footage, that's now a felony in Florida, punishable by up to 5 years. I should say now, I think the law actually goes into effect in October 1st, if memory serves. I'll throw a link to the actual legislation in the show notes. And so, anyway, this exact behavior, this exact sort of situation was suddenly criminalized in Florida. And that law, records show, was written by lobbyists for Troy Link. So records show that in December 2024, one of Troy Link's companies hired a lobbying firm in Tallahassee. And those lobbyists immediately began meeting with legislators about criminalizing drone surveillance. And so I found one email in this records request that shows a December 2024 meeting in which a lobbyist is pitching this idea to Senator Aaron Grawl, a Republican from Vero Beach, whose district includes the Quail Creek Sporting Ranch. And in the email, they say very clearly the meeting is to discuss legislation relating to unauthorized drone use that has been an issue for our client, Jack Link's Troy Link in parentheses, at his hunting ranch. And so Aaron Grawl and another Republican legislator from the area, Kaylee Tuck, a Republican in the state house, both agreed to file a bill on Troy Link's behalf, criminalizing drones. But then, as you go through this stuff, you learn a better option emerged. There was a different bill already filed, House Bill 112 and 1121, and this was sponsored by a Republican from Polk County, the Lakeland area, Jennifer Canady, who's a really important legislator. She's in line to become Speaker of the House in a few years. Would be the first female Speaker of the House in Florida history, if memory serves. And she was already sponsoring a bill dealing with like beefing up penalties, beefing up criminal penalties around illegal drone use, but in the sort of like national security, national defense kind of context. So like the bill she originally had, House Bill 1121, in its original state, it basically like beefed up the penalties around like flying drones around critical infrastructure like prisons or power plants, that sort of thing, installing anti-drone or anti-aircraft detection systems on drones, using drones that are equipped with real or fake weapons. This legislation was also gave law enforcement some more freedom to use drones to surveil crowds or in protection of Ron DeSantis, in protection of the governor. But so Troy Link's lobbyists reached out to Jennifer Canady and a guy by the name of a state senator by the name of Keith Truenow, a Republican from Lake County, sort of northwest of Orlando here, who is sponsoring the same bill in the Senate. They reached out to Canady and Truenow and got them to take the language they had written, the Troy Link's lobbyists had written, criminalizing sort of drone surveillance of private property, and got Jennifer Canady and Keith Truenow to just add that language into their bill. So, I've got these records requests turned up. There was another email that shows one of Troy Link's lobbyists emailing Jennifer Canady's office the language, which then she put onto her bill almost verbatim, and she did it in like this bill hearing, this hearing before the House Criminal Justice Subcommittee that lasted, I'm not kidding you, 3 minutes. It was 3 minutes long. And these bills, House Bill 1121 and the Senate companion, from that point on, just breezed through the legislature because who wants to oppose a bill that criminalizes carrying chemical weapons on a drone, right? Like no opposition whatsoever. Now, neither Link nor any of his lobbyists ever testified on this bill. And legislators never really talked about this part. They almost always framed this in terms of national security and national defense, or domestic security, national defense, that sort of thing. In fact, here's how Jennifer Canady described the bill on the floor of the Florida House.
Representative Canady and others, CS for House Bill 1121, a bill to be entitled, an act relating to unmanned aircraft and unmanned aircraft systems.
Representative Canady, you're recognized to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. CS for HB 1121 will protect Floridians from bad actors using drones to harm them. It will amend the Unmanned Aircraft System statute to address growing concerns regarding public safety and national security threats posed by the misuse of drones. These changes will enhance the state's ability to prevent dangerous and illicit activities involving unmanned aircraft systems, such as the delivery of contraband to correctional facilities, surveillance of critical infrastructure, and even the potential use of chemical warfare. By enacting these changes, Florida will take a proactive stance in curbing the misuse of unmanned aircraft systems, helping to safeguard critical infrastructure, improve prison security, and protect the public from potential domestic threats. And that, Mr. Speaker, is the bill.
These changes will enhance the state's ability to prevent dangerous and illicit activities involving unmanned aircraft systems, such as the delivery of contraband to correctional facilities, surveillance of critical infrastructure, and even the potential use of chemical warfare. Chemical warfare is what they invoked. Like, again, who's going to oppose that, right? No mention of the piece of this bill that was added to protect, to help the beef jerky magnate who ran into hot water with animal rights groups. And in fact, in the few instances, I went back and watched every hearing on this piece of legislation. And in the few instances where lawmakers even alluded to this stuff, to the portion of the bill just criminalizing surveillance of private property or recording of private property, legislators would always invoke the same idea, that the horror story of a drone hovering outside the window of the bedroom window of someone's teenage daughter, right? They made it seem like that was the motivation for the bill, when this bill wasn't about protecting, teenage daughters. It was about protecting dudes that want to, kill birds in private, essentially. They never mentioned the real motivation here. They absolutely were hiding their intentions, at least on this piece of the bill. And what that does is that robs any chance for a good faith debate on this, because obviously there are legitimate privacy concerns around people using drones to record people on their own private property. I think I probably can get on board with what this bill ultimately did, but there are trade-offs here. So as I mentioned, as part of this story, I reached out to the Animal Wellness Action and Shark as part of this, to see what they thought of sort of how this had played out. And one of the things they told me was that surveillance using drones is like critically important. It's essential, was what they told me, to exposing cockfighting rings, dog fighting rings, these sorts of things, And so we are absolutely inhibiting that sort of ability here. And maybe that's a trade-off that we need to make, but that should have been an issue that was talked about publicly and debated in good faith. And the Florida legislature absolutely did not allow that to happen, because again, you're not just protecting innocent people here, you're potentially protecting bad actors as well. And so, we never got a chance to have that debate, and there it is. The bill passed. And the other thing that a story like this shows, because again, the policy itself, I think I could get to the point of the privacy concerns outweigh some of the other tools. Yeah, some of the other reasons to allow this thing. I would like to hear a more substantive debate about it, but I think I could get there. But the other thing is, this is one of those classic stories that just shows you whose problems Ron DeSantis and the Florida legislature will choose to solve. The Republican-controlled Florida legislature, to be clear, because Troy Link is not just the CEO of Jack Link's Meat Snacks. He's also a Republican mega donor. I mean, he's an enormous Republican contributor at the state and national level. So he's going over the last few years, he's given more than $200,000 just to Ron DeSantis. That includes a $50,000 contribution to the super PAC that Ron DeSantis had set up to back his failed presidential campaign in 2023. Troy Link was an enormous donor to Elon Musk's super PAC during the 2024 presidential election as well. He's been a big donor to Donald Trump. He also, the lobbying firm he hired here was run by literally one of Ron DeSantis' biggest political fundraisers. I mean, this is if you had been caught by a drone, a neighbor had been bugging you with a drone somehow, and you turned to the legislature asking for help with that, the odds of them responding so quickly and thoroughly to you versus a guy like a Republican mega donor like this, just ask yourself how confident you would have gotten the same immediate passage of a new law if you'd turned to your local legislator for help, right? This reminds me of one of the pieces of advice when I first showed up in Tallahassee. This is more than 20 years ago, that 90% of what happens during the legislative session is a trade show. It's just doing a favor for a business or an influential donor. That's and it certainly seems to me that that's what House Bill 1121 was, at least this particular piece of it. So I'm going to leave it there. We're still digging into this. And obviously, like I said earlier, there are a lot more stories coming out of these records. Some others around issues that we've been writing about, some already on the newsletter. We'll get more detail about those. In other cases, new issues like this one. So I hope, if you haven't already, again, please think about signing up for a subscription. Easiest place to find us is at seekingrentsfl.com. That'll have every story and podcast we do sent straight to your inbox. Like I said at the top, subscriptions are free. Nothing's behind a paywall, but there is that option to voluntarily pay for a subscription if you've got the means. And as I said, these public records requests that lead to stories like these aren't cheap. So we're grateful for all our subscribers, but particularly those who choose to voluntarily pay for a subscription too. So, and with that, one last reminder: like and subscribe. That helps spread the content around and helps us grow this. And with that, we'll talk again very soon. Take care.